The moment Grace Miller stepped off the stagecoach into the dusty streets of Red Bluff, California, she knew she had made a terrible mistake. The sun was setting behind the Sierra Nevada mountains in late October of 1877, casting long shadows across the wooden storefronts and saloons that lined the main street. She wore a white lace dress that had once been pristine, but was now covered in dust and grime from the long journey. In her trembling hands, she clutched a small carpet bag containing everything she owned in the world. The wind picked up, colder than she had expected, and she wrapped her arms around herself as she looked for the man she was supposed to marry. Thomas Ridgeway stood outside the general store, a portly man in his late 40s with thinning hair and small, calculating eyes. He looked nothing like the photograph he had sent her back in Boston. That picture had shown a younger, more robust man, but the reality before her was a man whose face was already reddening from drink, his vest straining against his considerable girth. "You are Grace Miller?" he asked, his voice flat and uninterested as he looked her up and down like she was livestock. "Yes, sir," she said quietly, her breath visible in the cooling air. "I received your letter and your offer of marriage. You are younger than I thought. How old are you exactly?" 22, sir." "I wrote that in my letter." Well, you will do. Come along then. The preacher is waiting at my ranch. We will get this done tonight." Grace felt her stomach drop. She had expected at least a few days to get to know the man who had paid for her passage west, who had promised her a home and security in his letters. But Thomas was already walking toward a wagon, not even offering to carry her bag or help her up. She climbed into the back herself, her fingers numb with cold. The ride to his ranch took nearly an hour, and as darkness fell completely, the temperature dropped even further. Grace began to shiver uncontrollably in her thin dress. She had sold her winter coat to pay for supplies for the journey, thinking California would be warmer. Thomas said nothing to her the entire ride, and when she tried to make conversation, he only grunted in response. They passed through open rangeland dotted with cattle, the landscape growing more isolated with each passing mile. Grace noticed other riders in the distance, cowboys moving herds or riding between ranches. One rider in particular caught her attention, a tall figure on a paint horse who seemed to be watching their wagon from a hillside. But her attention was quickly drawn back to her immediate predicament, as Thomas finally stopped the wagon in front of a ramshackle house that looked barely weatherproof. "This is your home now," Thomas said. "The preacher should be here any minute. Get yourself cleaned up." Grace climbed down from the wagon, her legs stiff and her body shaking from the cold. The house was dark inside, lit only by a single lamp that Thomas roughly shoved into her hands. The interior was filthy, with unwashed dishes piled in a basin and clothing strewn across every surface. The smell of stale liquor and tobacco hung heavy in the air. "I thought," Grace began hesitantly, "that perhaps we might wait a day or two before the ceremony, to get acquainted properly." Thomas turned on her, his face twisted with anger. "I paid good money to bring you here, girl. I need a wife to cook and clean and warm my bed, not a courtship. You will marry me tonight, or I will put you out and you can find your own way back to wherever you came from." Fear gripped Grace's heart. She had no money, no way to get back to Boston, and no family to help her even if she could return. Her mother had died 2 years ago, and her father had drunk himself to death shortly after, leaving her with nothing but debts. The mail-order bride arrangement had seemed like her only option, her only chance at survival. But now, looking at this cruel man and his wretched home, she wondered if starvation might have been preferable. Before she could respond, there was a knock at the door. Thomas opened it to reveal not a preacher, but a thin, nervous-looking man who smelled even more strongly of alcohol than Thomas did. "Preacher could not make it," the man said, swaying slightly. "Says he will come tomorrow or the next day." Thomas cursed loudly and slammed the door in the man's face. He turned to Grace with a look that made her blood run cold. "Well, we will just have to make do without the formalities tonight." "No," Grace said, her voice barely a whisper. "Please, I cannot. Not without being properly married." "You will do as I say, girl. I own you now. Paid for you fair and square." Grace backed away toward the door, her heart pounding. "I am not property, sir. I came here in good faith to be your wife, but I will not be treated this way." Thomas lunged for her, but Grace was quicker. She grabbed her carpet bag and ran out the door into the cold night. Behind her, she heard Thomas shouting, but she did not stop. She ran blindly into the darkness, away from the house, away from the man who had lured her across the country with lies. The cold hit her immediately, stealing the breath from her lungs. She had not realized how much the temperature had dropped. Her thin wedding dress offered no protection against the biting wind that swept across the open range. She ran until her legs gave out, collapsing behind a rocky outcropping about a quarter-mile from the house. She could hear Thomas still yelling in the distance, but he did not seem to be following her. Perhaps he was too drunk to bother, or perhaps he assumed the cold would drive her back. But Grace would rather freeze to death than return to that house. She curled up against the rocks, pulling her carpet bag close to her chest, and tried to stop shivering. Her teeth chattered so hard she thought they might break. Her fingers and toes went numb first, then the numbness began to spread. She thought of her mother, of her childhood in Boston, of all the dreams she had once had for her life. None of them had ended like this. She did not know how much time had passed when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. Fear shot through her. Had Thomas come after her? She tried to make herself smaller against the rocks, but her body was shaking so violently now that she could barely control her movements. "Madam," a voice called out, deep and concerned. "Madam, are you out here?" Grace could not answer. Her jaw was locked from the cold, her lips blue. The hoofbeats came closer, and then a figure appeared, tall and broad-shouldered, leading a paint horse. In the moonlight, Grace could make out a weathered face under a wide-brimmed hat, strong features that showed concern rather than cruelty. The man knelt beside her, and she could see he was young, perhaps in his late 20s, with kind eyes that widened when he saw her condition. "Good Lord, madam, you are freezing to death," he said. Without hesitation, he began unwrapping a thick wool blanket from his bedroll. He wrapped it around her shoulders, then pulled it tighter, cocooning her in its warmth. The blanket smelled of horse and sage and wood smoke, and it was the most wonderful thing Grace had ever felt. "You are the first to care," she managed to whisper through chattering teeth, tears streaming down her frozen cheeks. The cowboy's expression softened with something like pain. "Come on, let us get you somewhere warm. Can you stand?" Grace tried, but her legs would not support her. Without a word, the cowboy scooped her up in his arms, blanket and all, and lifted her as easily as if she weighed nothing. He settled her on his horse, then swung up behind her, keeping one arm firmly around her waist to hold her steady. The warmth of his body against her back was like a furnace, and Grace found herself leaning into it instinctively. "My name is Yates Sullivan," he said as they began to ride. "I have a line shack about 2 miles from here. It is not much, but it has a stove and it will be warm." "Can you tell me your name, Grace?" she managed. "Grace Miller." "Well, Miss Miller, you are going to be all right, I promise you that." Grace wanted to ask him why he was out here, why he had been looking for her, but she could not form the words. Her entire body ached from the cold, and exhaustion was pulling at her consciousness. She felt Yates tighten his arm around her. "Stay awake now," he said gently. "Talk to me. Where did you come from?" "Boston," she whispered. "I came to marry Thomas Ridgeway." She felt Yates stiffen behind her. "Ridgeway? That no-good drunk. Begging your pardon, madam, but that man is not fit to marry anyone." "I discovered that," Grace said, her voice gaining a little strength from the warmth of the blanket and Yates's body heat. "He wanted to force himself on me before we were even married. I ran." Yates cursed under his breath. "I saw him load you into his wagon in town. Something about the way he was treating you did not sit right with me. I followed at a distance, just to make sure you were safe. When I heard the shouting and saw you run, I waited to see if he would come after you. When he did not, I figured I had better find you before you froze." "You saved my life," Grace said, fresh tears warming her cold cheeks. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Grace said firmly. "Thomas would not have. He would have let me die." "You are the first person in a very long time who has shown me any kindness without wanting something in return." Yates did not respond to that, but Grace felt his arm tighten around her just a fraction, a protective gesture that made her feel safer than she had in months. The line shack appeared out of the darkness, a small wooden structure that looked ancient but sturdy. Yates helped Grace down from the horse, keeping the blanket wrapped tightly around her. He tied his horse to a post and then guided her inside, one arm supporting her as she stumbled on legs that still were not working properly. Inside, the line shack was sparse but clean. There was a small iron stove, a narrow cot with neatly folded blankets, a table with 2 chairs, and shelves holding supplies. Yates immediately went to work building a fire in the stove, and within minutes, blessed warmth began to fill the small space. "Sit here, close to the stove," he said, pulling one of the chairs near the heat. "Let me get you something warm to drink." Grace sat, still wrapped in his blanket, and watched as Yates moved efficiently around the small space. He heated water in a battered coffee pot and mixed in something from a tin. When he handed her the cup, steam rose from it, fragrant and inviting. "What is this?" she asked. "Coffee with a bit of honey and whiskey," he said. "The whiskey will help warm you from the inside. Just sip it slowly." Grace obeyed, and the warm liquid seemed to bring her body back to life. As sensation returned to her extremities, pain came with it, a burning, tingling sensation in her fingers and toes. She winced. "I know it hurts," Yates said gently, "but pain means nothing froze permanently. You were lucky. Another hour out there and you might have lost fingers or toes." "Lucky," Grace repeated, and suddenly the reality of everything that had happened crashed over her. She had traveled 2,000 miles to marry a monster. She had nearly frozen to death. She had no money, no home, no prospects. What was she going to do? Where could she go? The tears started again, and once they began, she could not stop them. Great heaving sobs shook her body. Yates knelt in front of her, his face level with hers. "Hey now," he said softly. "You are safe. Whatever happened, you are safe now." "But what am I going to do?" Grace cried. "I have nothing. Nowhere to go. I cannot go back to Boston. I have no family, no money. I cannot even pay you back for your kindness." "I do not want payment," Yates said firmly, "and you do not need to figure everything out tonight. Tonight, you just need to get warm and rest. Tomorrow, we will work out what comes next." "But Thomas," Grace said, fear creeping into her voice, "what if he comes looking for me? What if he forces me to go back?" Yates's jaw tightened. "No one is going to force you to do anything. I will make sure of that. You do not even know me. Why would you do this for a stranger?" Yates was quiet for a moment, his eyes searching her face. "My mother was a mail-order bride," he finally said. "She came out west to marry a man she had never met. He turned out to be cruel, beat her regularly. She had nowhere to go, no one to help her. She died when I was 10, and I have always believed it was the abuse that killed her, even though the doctor said it was fever. I swore after she died that if I ever had the chance to help a woman in that situation, I would. So you see, Miss Miller, you are not just any stranger. Grace's heart ached at the pain in his voice. I am so sorry about your mother. It was a long time ago, Yates said, standing up. But it taught me that sometimes the most important thing a person can do is show kindness when someone needs it most. He gestured to the cot. You should rest now. Take the bed. I will sleep in the chair. I cannot take your bed, Grace protested. Yes, you can and you will, Yates said with a small smile. I have slept in worse places than a chair, I promise you. Grace was too exhausted to argue further. She moved to the cot, still wrapped in Yates's blanket, and lay down. The mattress was thin and the pillow was lumpy, but it felt like heaven. Within minutes, despite everything that had happened, she fell into a deep sleep. When Grace woke, sunlight was streaming through the small window of the lined shack. For a moment, she could not remember where she was, and then the events of the previous night came flooding back. She sat up quickly, looking around. Yates was not in the chair. In fact, he was not in the shack at all. Panic gripped her. Had he left her here? Had he changed his mind about helping her? But then the door opened and Yates stepped inside, carrying a bucket of water. His face brightened when he saw she was awake. "Good morning," he said. "I hope you slept well. I brought fresh water from the creek. There is enough to wash with if you would like." "Thank you," Grace said, pushing her tangled hair back from her face. She must look a fright. "What time is it?" "Near about 9 o'clock. I have been up since dawn. I work for the Double Bar Ranch, and this lined shack sits on the edge of their property. I need to ride out to check on the cattle in the north pastures, but I did not want to leave without making sure you were all right first." Grace felt a pang of disappointment that he had to leave, followed immediately by guilt. This man had already done so much for her. She could not expect him to abandon his responsibilities. "I understand," she said. "You have been more than kind. I will be fine." Yates looked at her skeptically. "Will you? What is your plan, Miss Miller?" Grace opened her mouth to answer but realized she had no idea what to say. She had no plan, no prospects, nothing. Yates sighed and sat down in the chair across from her. "Look, I have been thinking about this half the night. Red Bluff is not a large town, but there are good people there. The widow Henderson runs a boarding house, and she is always looking for help. I think she might give you a room in exchange for work until you can get on your feet. And the general store owner, Mr. Patterson, his wife just had a baby. They might need help as well." "You would help me find work?" Grace asked, surprised. "Of course. But there is something you need to know first. Thomas Ridgeway is likely going to cause trouble. He paid for your passage, and he is going to see that as money owed. He might try to claim you broke a contract or some such nonsense." "Can he do that? Legally, I mean. In a proper court of law, probably not. You are not property, and you cannot be forced to marry someone." "But Red Bluff does not always go by proper law. The sheriff is a decent man, but Ridgeway has friends, other ranchers who might support him just out of principle. We need to be careful." Grace felt hope and fear warring in her chest. "Why are you doing all this for me? You do not owe me anything." Yates met her eyes, and she was struck again by the kindness she saw there. "Maybe I do not owe you anything, but that does not mean I cannot help. You said last night that I was the first to care. That is about the saddest thing I ever heard. Everyone deserves to have people who care about them." Something shifted in Grace's heart at those words. She had been alone for so long, struggling to survive in a world that seemed determined to grind her down. The idea that someone might care what happened to her, might go out of their way to help her, was almost too much to bear. "I do not know how to thank you," she said softly. "Then do not. Just promise me you will let me help you get settled before you make any decisions about what to do next." "I promise," Grace said. Yates stood up. All right then. I need to ride out for a few hours, but I will be back by early afternoon. There is food in the cupboard. Bread, some dried beef, beans. Help yourself to whatever you need. And Miss Miller? Yes. Lock the door after I leave. Do not open it for anyone but me. If Ridgeway somehow tracks you here, do not let him in. Grace nodded, fresh fear prickling at her spine. She watched as Yates gathered a few supplies, checked that there was enough wood for the stove, and then headed for the door. He paused in the doorway and looked back at her. You are going to be all right, he said again. I promise. After he left, Grace did as he instructed and locked the door. She stood at the window and watched him ride away on his paint horse until he disappeared over a hill. Then she turned back to survey her temporary sanctuary. She used the fresh water to wash as best she could, removing the dust and grime of travel. Her white dress was ruined, stained, and torn, but it was all she had. She found a needle and thread in a small sewing kit on one of the shelves and spent the morning mending the worst of the tears. As she worked, she thought about Yates Sullivan. He was unlike any man she had ever met. In Boston, the men she had known had been either too refined and dismissive of anyone below their social station, or too rough and looking only for what they could take. Yates was different. He was strong and capable, clearly comfortable in this harsh land, but there was a gentleness to him, a core of decency that shone through everything he did, and he was handsome. Grace felt her cheeks warm at the thought. She had noticed last night, even through her fear and cold, the strong lines of his face, the breadth of his shoulders. In the daylight before he left, she had seen more. Sun-darkened skin, dark brown hair that curled slightly at his collar, hands that were calloused from work but moved with surprising grace. He had to be close to 30, she guessed, old enough to have experience but young enough to have the vitality of youth. She shook her head, trying to dispel these thoughts. It was foolish to think of him that way. He was helping her out of kindness and the memory of his mother, nothing more. She could not repay his generosity by developing romantic feelings that would only make things awkward. But as the morning turned to afternoon and she waited for his return, Grace found her eyes constantly drawn to the window, watching for the sight of a rider on a paint horse. Yates returned in the early afternoon as promised, and with him came a bundle wrapped in brown paper. I stopped by the boarding house in town, he explained as Grace unlocked the door to let him in. Mrs. Henderson was kind enough to lend you some clothes. They belonged to her daughter who moved to San Francisco. She said you can keep them. Grace unwrapped the bundle to find 2 simple dresses, one brown and one dark blue, along with a warmer shawl and some undergarments. Tears pricked her eyes at this kindness from a stranger. Did you tell her about me? Grace asked. I told her that a young woman had arrived in town to marry Ridgeway, discovered his true nature, and needed help. She did not need to know more than that. Mrs. Henderson has a good heart. She said she would be happy to meet with you tomorrow and discuss the possibility of work. Tomorrow. Grace felt a flutter of nervousness. If you are ready. If you need more time, that is fine too, but I thought the sooner we get you settled in town, the better. Out here, you are isolated. In town, you will have people around you, witnesses if Ridgeway tries anything. You think he will try something? Yates's expression was grim. I rode past his ranch today. He was in town earlier asking around about you. He is telling people you stole money from him and ran off. Grace gasped. That is a lie. I never took anything from him. I know that, and anyone with sense will know that too. But Ridgeway is trying to turn public opinion against you before you can tell your side of the story. That is why I think we need to get you to town tomorrow. You need to establish yourself as part of the community, not some runaway bride. Grace felt overwhelmed. It seemed that every time she thought she understood her situation, it became more complicated. "What should I do?" "Tell the truth," Yates said simply. "Tell Mrs. Henderson and anyone else who asks what really happened. Do not embellish, do not dramatize. Just tell them the plain truth. Most folks in Red Bluff are decent people. They will see through Ridgway's lies. And if they do not—" Yates was quiet for a moment. "Then we will figure something else out. But do not borrow trouble, Miss Miller. Let us take this one step at a time." They spent the rest of the afternoon talking. Yates told her about the Double Bar Ranch where he worked, about the owner, Jacob Barnes, who was a fair man and a good employer. He told her about life in Red Bluff, about the characters who populated the town, the challenges and joys of living in this part of California. Grace found herself relaxing as they talked, laughing at some of his stories about mishaps with cattle and horses. In turn, she told him about her life in Boston, about her parents and their descent into poverty after her father's business failed. She told him about the loneliness of being a young woman alone in the world, about the desperation that had driven her to answer Thomas Ridgeway's advertisement. "I thought any husband would be better than no husband," she admitted. "I thought security was worth whatever price I might have to pay. I was wrong." "You were just trying to survive," Yates said gently. "There is no shame in that." As evening fell, Yates prepared a simple meal of beans and bacon, along with the bread from the morning. They ate together at the small table, and Grace marveled at how comfortable it felt, how natural. It was as if they had known each other for years rather than just a day. After dinner, as Yates prepared to settle into the chair for another night, Grace made a decision. "I cannot let you sleep in that chair again," she said. "You will ruin your back. The bed is wide enough for two people if we maintain a respectful distance." Yates looked startled. "Miss Miller, I do not think that would be proper." "What is proper about any of this situation?" Grace asked. "You saved my life. You have given me shelter and food and help. The least I can do is share the bed so you can get a decent night's sleep. I trust you completely, Mr. Sullivan. I know you will be a perfect gentleman." Yates looked torn, and Grace could see the exhaustion in his face. He had been working all day and had probably not slept much the night before. "Please," she said softly, "I will not be able to rest knowing you are uncomfortable because of me." Finally, Yates nodded. "All right, but I will sleep on top of the blankets and you will stay underneath them." "Agreed, agreed," Grace said. They arranged themselves awkwardly on the narrow cot, Yates on top of the blankets near the wall, Grace tucked under them on the outer edge. There was still barely any space between them, and Grace was intensely aware of his presence, of the warmth radiating from his body, of the rise and fall of his breathing. "Thank you," Yates said quietly into the darkness, "for trusting me." "Thank you for being trustworthy," Grace replied. They fell silent, and Grace expected to lie awake for hours, hyper-aware of the man beside her. But instead, she felt a profound sense of safety that she had not experienced in years. Within minutes, she drifted off to sleep. The next morning, they rose early and prepared for the trip into Red Bluff. Grace wore one of the dresses Mrs. Henderson had sent, the brown one that fit reasonably well. With her hair brushed and braided and her face clean, she looked far more presentable than she had 2 days ago when she had stepped off the stagecoach. Yates saddled his horse, and once again, Grace rode in front of him. This time, though, it was not an emergency rescue but a companionable journey. They talked as they rode, and Grace found herself dreading the moment when they would reach town and she would have to establish her independence. These hours alone with Yates had become precious to her. Red Bluff looked different in the morning light, less threatening than it had seemed that first evening. The main street was busy with people going about their daily business. Grace noticed several of them watching as she and Yates rode past, and she wondered what they were thinking. Did they know about her? Had Ridgway spread his lies effectively? Yates guided his horse to a neat, two-story house on a side street. A sign out front read Henderson's boarding house in careful letters. An older woman with silver hair and a kind face was sweeping the front porch. "Mrs. Henderson," Yates called out as he dismounted. "This is Miss Grace Miller, the young woman I mentioned yesterday." Mrs. Henderson set aside her broom and came down the steps, her eyes assessing Grace with a shrewd but not unkind gaze. "So you are the girl who was supposed to marry Thomas Ridgeway." "What happened, child?" Grace took a deep breath and told her story, just as Yates had advised. She did not embellish or dramatize. She simply explained that Thomas had misrepresented himself in his letters, that he had tried to force himself on her before they were married, and that she had fled for her own safety. Mrs. Henderson's expression grew darker as the story progressed. When Grace finished, the older woman shook her head in disgust. "That man is a menace," she said. "I have heard stories about him before, about how he treats his workers. I am glad you got away from him, dear, and Mr. Sullivan here was right to bring you to me." "He said you might have work for me," Grace ventured. "I am willing to do anything. I am a hard worker and I learn quickly." "Can you cook?" "Yes, madam, and clean, do laundry, mend clothes, whatever you need." Mrs. Henderson nodded. "I take in boarders, mostly men who work in town or on the nearby ranches. They need feeding 3 times a day and their rooms kept clean. The work is hard and the pay is not much, but I can offer you a room of your own and meals in addition to a small wage. Would that suit you?" "Yes, madam," Grace said, relief flooding through her. "That would suit me very well, thank you. All right then, you can start today. Mr. Sullivan, thank you for bringing her. You are a good man." Yates tipped his hat. "Thank you for taking her in, Mrs. Henderson. I knew I could count on you." He turned to Grace, and she saw something like regret in his eyes. "I need to get back to the ranch, but I will check on you in a few days if that is all right with you." "Please do," Grace said, and she was surprised by how much she meant it. The thought of not seeing him for days felt like a physical ache. "If Ridgway causes any trouble, you send word to me at the Double Bar Ranch. I will come right away." "I will. Thank you, Yates, for everything." They stood looking at each other for a long moment, and Grace wished desperately that she could think of something else to say, something that would express the depth of her gratitude and the feelings that were beginning to take root in her heart. But then Mrs. Henderson cleared her throat, breaking the moment, and Yates stepped back. "Take care of yourself, Miss Miller," he said, and then he mounted his horse and rode away. Grace watched until he disappeared from sight, then turned to follow Mrs. Henderson into the boarding house. The next several days passed in a blur of hard work. Mrs. Henderson had 8 boarders, and keeping them fed and their rooms clean kept Grace busy from before dawn until late in the evening. But she did not mind. The work was honest and good, and Mrs. Henderson was a fair employer who treated her with respect. The other boarders were kind to her as well, once they got to know her. There was old Pete, who had worked in the mines and now did odd jobs around town. There was Samuel, a young clerk at the general store who was shy and bookish. There were 4 ranch hands from various nearby properties, and the town blacksmith, a huge man named Tom who had gentle eyes and a booming laugh. They all asked about her story, and Grace told them the same simple truth she had told Mrs. Henderson. Most of them nodded sympathetically. A few mentioned that they had heard Ridgway's version, where he painted her as a thief and a liar, but none of them seemed to believe it. "Any man who would say such things about a woman is no man at all," old Pete declared one evening at dinner, and the others nodded in agreement. Grace began to feel like she might actually build a life for herself in Red Bluff. She made a little money from her wages, which she carefully saved. She attended church on Sunday with Mrs. Henderson and met more of the townspeople. She even visited the general store and met Mr. Patterson and his wife, who asked if she might be willing to help them a few afternoons a week. Grace agreed eagerly, happy to have the extra work and income. But through it all, she thought constantly of Yates. She had not seen him since he had dropped her off at the boarding house nearly a week ago. She wondered if he thought of her at all, or if she had simply been a problem solved, a good deed done, now fading from his memory. On the 8th day after she had come to the boarding house, Grace was hanging laundry in the backyard when Mrs. Henderson called to her from the back door. "Grace, dear, you have a visitor." Grace's heart leaped. She wiped her hands on her apron and hurried inside, hoping desperately that it was Yates. But the man standing in the parlor was not Yates. It was Thomas Ridgeway, and he looked furious. "There you are," he said, his voice dripping with false concern. "I have been so worried about you, my dear. Running off like that in the middle of the night. Thank God you are safe." Grace felt Mrs. Henderson move to stand beside her, a protective presence. "Mr. Ridgeway," the older woman said coldly, "Miss Miller has explained the circumstances of her departure from your home. I think it would be best if you left. With all due respect, Mrs. Henderson, this is between me and my fiancé. Grace, come along now. We have a wedding to arrange." "I am not your fiancé," Grace said, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the fear coursing through her. "I never agreed to marry you, Mr. Ridgeway. I came here with the intention of getting to know you first, but when you tried to force yourself on me, I knew I could never marry you." "That is not how I remember it," Thomas said, his eyes narrowing. "I remember paying good money to bring you out here and you agreeing to be my wife. That is a contract, Miss Miller. And when you ran off, you broke that contract. I am within my rights to demand restitution." "Restitution?" Mrs. Henderson said sharply. "What are you talking about?" "She owes me the money I spent bringing her here. Train ticket, stagecoach fare, new dress I had made for her. It all adds up to considerable sum. If she will not honor the marriage contract, then she needs to pay me back." Grace felt the blood drain from her face. She had no money, at least not enough to pay back what Thomas was claiming. "I never asked you to buy me a dress, and the travel costs were your choice. I never signed any contract." "Your letter accepting my proposal was a contract," Thomas insisted. "I have it right here." He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. "See, you agreed to become my wife. That is a binding agreement." "It is not binding if you misrepresented yourself," Mrs. Henderson said firmly, "and it certainly is not binding if you attempted to assault her." "Assault?" Thomas laughed, but it was an ugly sound. "Is that what she told you? I never assaulted anyone. I simply wanted to exercise my rights as her future husband. If she was not willing to be a proper wife, she should have said so before I wasted my money." "Get out, Mrs. Henderson said, her voice like iron. "Get out of my house right now, or I will fetch the sheriff." "The sheriff is a friend of mine," Thomas said smugly. "But fine, I will leave. But this is not over, Miss Miller. One way or another you will pay what you owe me." He turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. Grace sank into a chair, her legs shaking. "Can he really make me pay him back?" Mrs. Henderson sat down beside her and took her hand. "I do not know, dear, but we will fight it if he tries. There are good people in this town who will stand up for you." "I need to tell Yates," Grace said suddenly. "He told me to send word if Thomas caused trouble. Then we will send word." "Samuel," Mrs. Henderson called, and the young store clerk appeared in the doorway. "I need you to ride out to the Double Bar Ranch and ask for Yates Sullivan. Tell him that Grace needs him. Can you do that?" "Yes, madam," Samuel said, grabbing his hat. "I will go right now." As Samuel hurried out, Grace felt tears threatening. "I am so much trouble," she said. "Maybe I should just leave, go somewhere else, start over." "You will do no such thing," Mrs. Henderson said firmly. "You have done nothing wrong, Grace. Nothing. And we are not going to let that bully intimidate you." But as the afternoon wore on and there was no sign of Yates, Grace's anxiety grew. What if he did not come? What if he had decided she was too much trouble? What if Thomas made good on his threats? Evening was falling when Grace heard the sound of hoofbeats outside. She looked out the window and saw Yates dismounting from his paint horse, his expression grim and determined. Relief washed over her so powerfully that she felt dizzy. Mrs. Henderson opened the door before he could knock. "Thank God you are here, Mr. Sullivan. That awful Ridgeway man was here this afternoon making threats." Yates stepped inside, his eyes immediately finding Grace. "Are you all right?" "I am now," Grace said, and she meant it. Just seeing him made her feel safer. "Tell me exactly what happened." Grace recounted the conversation with Thomas, including his claims about the contract and the money. Yates listened intently, his jaw tightening with anger. "He cannot force you to pay him back," Yates said when she finished. "A proposal of marriage is not a legal contract, not in the way he is claiming. But he might try to make trouble anyway, might try to turn people against you." "What should I do?" Yates was quiet for a moment, thinking. "I think we need to go to the sheriff, make an official complaint about his attempt to assault you that first night. Get your version of events on record before he can twist the story any further." "Will the sheriff believe me?" Thomas said they were friends. "Sheriff Morrison is a fair man. He and Ridgeway might be friendly, but the sheriff takes his job seriously. If you make a formal complaint, he will have to investigate." "Will you come with me?" Grace asked. "Of course. We can go first thing in the morning." Mrs. Henderson cleared her throat. "It is getting late, Mr. Sullivan. Would you like to stay for supper? I always make extra and you are more than welcome." Yates glanced at Grace and she nodded eagerly. "Please stay." "Thank you, madam. I would appreciate that." Dinner that evening was a lively affair, with all the boarders present and Yates fitting in easily with the group. Grace watched him as he talked and laughed with the other men, noticing how they respected him, how they listened when he spoke. She saw old Pete lean over and say something to him, and Yates's eyes found hers across the table. He smiled, a warm, genuine smile that made her heart skip. After dinner, as the other boarders dispersed to their rooms or out to the saloons, Yates asked Grace if she would like to take a walk. Mrs. Henderson gave them a knowing look but nodded her permission. They walked through the quiet evening streets of Red Bluff, the air cool but not as bitterly cold as it had been that first night. The stars were beginning to appear overhead, brilliant against the darkening sky. "How have you been?" Yates asked. "Really, better than I expected," Grace admitted. "Mrs. Henderson has been wonderful and the work keeps me busy, but I have missed you." She had not meant to say that last part and she felt her cheeks heat with embarrassment, but Yates did not seem bothered. "I have missed you too," he said quietly. "I wanted to come visit sooner, but I did not want to presume. I did not want you to think I expected anything from you just because I helped you." "I would never think that," Grace said. "You have been nothing but kind and respectful." They walked in silence for a moment and Grace gathered her courage. "Can I ask you something? Anything? Why have you never married? A man like you, kind and decent and hardworking, surely women must have shown interest." Yates was quiet for so long that Grace thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "I suppose I never found the right person. Growing up the way I did, seeing what my mother went through, it made me cautious. I did not want to make the wrong choice, did not want to end up making someone else unhappy. And then the years passed and I got comfortable with my life the way it was, until..." "Until what?" He stopped walking and turned to face her. Until I met you. Grace, I know this is not the time, and I know you have enough to deal with without me adding to it, but I have to be honest with you. When I wrapped that blanket around you that night, when you said I was the first to care, something changed for me. I have not been able to stop thinking about you. I know we have only known each other for a short time, but I have never felt this way about anyone before. Grace's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. I feel the same way, she whispered. I thought maybe I was foolish, that maybe it was just gratitude or the intensity of the circumstances. But every day that passed without seeing you felt wrong, like something was missing. And when you walked through Mrs. Henderson's door tonight, everything felt right again. Yates reached out and gently took her hand. I want to court you properly, Grace. I want to give you time to heal from what happened with Ridgeway, time to build your life here. But I want you to know that my intentions are serious. I am not just passing the time. When I look at you, I see my future. Tears welled in Grace's eyes, but these were tears of joy. I would be honored to be courted by you, Yates Sullivan. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. Then let us deal with Ridgeway first, make sure you are safe and settled, and then we will see where this road takes us. They walked back to the boarding house hand in hand, and when they said good night on the front porch, Yates brushed a strand of hair back from her face with such tenderness that Grace had to fight the urge to throw her arms around him. I will be back early tomorrow to go with you to the sheriff, he said. Try to get some rest. You too, and Yates, thank you for everything, but especially for being honest with me tonight. Always, he said. I will always be honest with you. Grace went inside feeling lighter than she had in years. Despite the looming threat of Thomas Ridgeway, despite all the uncertainty in her life, she felt hopeful for the first time since her mother had died. True to his word, Yates returned early the next morning. Together, they walked to the sheriff's office, a small building at the end of Main Street. Sheriff Morrison was a man in his 50s with gray hair and sharp eyes. He listened carefully as Grace told her story, occasionally interrupting to ask clarifying questions. So Ridgeway tried to force himself on you before you were even married, the sheriff said when she finished. Yes, sir. When I refused, I feared for my safety. That is why I ran. Sheriff Morrison looked at Yates. And you found her that night? Yes, sir. She was near frozen to death. I brought her to my line shack and then helped her get settled at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. The sheriff leaned back in his chair. I have known Tom Ridgeway for a while now. I will not say he is a good man because he is not. He drinks too much and he has a temper. But I have never known him to lie outright. Grace's heart sank. So you believe him over me? I did not say that, Miss Miller. I just said I need to be fair and investigate both sides. I will ride out to Ridgeway's place today and get his version of events. But I will tell you now, if you are telling the truth, then you have nothing to worry about. A man cannot force a woman into marriage, and he certainly cannot collect a debt for something that was never legally contracted. What about the things he said about me stealing from him? Grace asked. Did you steal anything from him? No, sir. I never even went inside his house except for a few minutes that first night. Then he has no proof of theft, and making false accusations is a serious matter. I will make sure he understands that. They left the sheriff's office feeling somewhat reassured, but Grace could not shake the feeling that this was not over. Thomas Ridgeway struck her as the kind of man who would not give up easily. Over the next several weeks, Grace settled into a routine. She worked at the boarding house and helped at the general store. She attended church and social gatherings, gradually becoming a known and accepted member of the Red Bluff community. And she spent as much time as she could with Yates. He was courting her properly, just as he had promised. He came to town every Sunday after church and took her for walks or picnics. He brought her small gifts, wildflowers from the range, a book of poetry he thought she might like. He was always respectful, never pushing her for more than she was ready to give, but his affection was evident in every gesture and every word. Grace fell more in love with him every day. She loved the way he listened when she talked, really listened, as if everything she said mattered. She loved his quiet strength, the way he could handle any situation calmly. She loved his sense of humor, the way he could make her laugh even when she was worried or tired. She loved the gentleness in his touch, the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her. But the shadow of Thomas Ridgeway still hung over them. Sheriff Morrison had visited Thomas and warned him to stay away from Grace, but Thomas was not one to give up easily. He continued to spread rumors about her in town, calling her a gold digger and a liar. Most people did not believe him, but there were a few who seemed willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. Then, 6 weeks after Grace had arrived in Red Bluff, things came to a head. It was a Saturday afternoon, and Grace was at the general store helping Mrs. Patterson restock shelves. Yates had ridden into town that morning and was planning to take her to dinner that evening. Grace was looking forward to it, thinking about what dress she would wear, when the door to the store banged open. Thomas Ridgeway stood in the doorway, swaying slightly. He was clearly drunk, his face red and his eyes unfocused. "There she is," he slurred, "the little thief who ruined my life." Mrs. Patterson stepped forward. "Mr. Ridgeway, you need to leave, now." "I will leave when I am good and ready," Thomas said. He pointed at Grace. "You owe me, girl. You owe me money, and you owe me the wife I paid for." "I do not owe you anything," Grace said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "Please leave, Mr. Ridgeway. You are drunk." "So what if I am? I have a right to drink on my own ranch. And I have a right to what is mine." He lurched forward, reaching for Grace. She backed away, but he was faster than she expected. His hand closed around her wrist, his grip painfully tight. "Let go of me," Grace said, trying to pull away. "Not until you come back where you belong." "I said let go." The voice that spoke was cold and hard, and everyone turned to see Yates standing in the doorway. He must have heard the commotion from the street. His expression was darker than Grace had ever seen it. "Sullivan," Thomas said, his sneer turning ugly. "Of course you would be here sniffing around my woman." "She is not your woman," Yates said, his voice deadly quiet. "She never was. Now let her go. Or what? You will fight me. I would like to see you try." "No, you would not," Yates said. "Because you are a bully and a coward, and you only pick on people smaller and weaker than you. Grace is none of those things. She is stronger than you will ever be. Now, for the last time, let her go." Thomas's face twisted with rage. He released Grace's wrist and took a clumsy swing at Yates. Yates easily dodged the punch and, with one swift movement, grabbed Thomas's arm and twisted it behind his back. Thomas cried out in pain and surprise. "Listen to me very carefully," Yates said, his voice still quiet but filled with steel. "You are going to leave Grace alone. You are going to stop spreading lies about her. You are going to go back to your ranch, and you are going to stay there. Because if you ever touch her again, if you ever threaten her again, there will not be a hole deep enough for you to hide in. Do you understand me?" "You cannot do this," Thomas gasped. "I will go to the sheriff. I will have you arrested for assault." "Go ahead," Yates said. "But there are 3 witnesses here who saw you grab Grace first, saw you threaten her. Who do you think the sheriff will believe?" He released Thomas with a shove that sent the drunk man stumbling toward the door. "Get out, and do not come back." Thomas glared at them all, his face purple with rage and humiliation. "This is not over," he spat, and then he stumbled out into the street. Grace realized she was shaking. Yates was at her side immediately, his earlier hardness replaced with concern. "Are you all right? Did he hurt you?" "I am fine," Grace said, but her voice trembled. Just scared." "He will not bother you again," Yates said firmly. "I will make sure of it." Mr. Patterson, who had emerged from the back room during the confrontation, nodded in agreement. "I will go get the sheriff right now. This has gone far enough." Over the next few days, things finally resolved. Sheriff Morrison, faced with multiple witnesses to Thomas's assault and threats, had a serious conversation with him. The sheriff made it clear that if Thomas came near Grace again, he would be arrested. Thomas, faced with the threat of jail time and the disapproval of the community, finally backed down. He retreated to his ranch and stayed there, and the gossip about Grace gradually died away. As autumn turned to winter, Grace's relationship with Yates deepened. They had survived the crisis with Thomas together, and it had only made their bond stronger. Yates had not just been her protector, he had been her partner, trusting her to be strong while also being there to support her when she needed it. On Christmas Eve, Yates took Grace to the church social. The entire town turned out for the event, and the church was decorated with pine boughs and candles. There was singing and dancing, hot cider and pies. Grace felt truly happy for the first time in years. As the evening drew to a close, Yates pulled Grace aside, away from the crowd. They stood outside the church, beneath a sky full of stars, the cold air making their breath visible. "Grace," Yates said, taking both of her hands in his, "I know we have only known each other for a few months. I know by some standards that is not very long. But I have never been more certain of anything in my life than I am of this. I love you. I love your strength and your courage. I love your kindness and your laugh. I love everything about you, and I want to spend the rest of my life showing you how much you are loved and valued." He dropped to one knee and Grace gasped, tears already forming in her eyes. "Grace Miller, will you marry me?" "Yes," Grace said, not even hesitating. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Yates stood and pulled a simple gold ring from his pocket. It was not fancy or expensive, but it was perfect. He slid it onto her finger, and then he kissed her, a kiss that was tender and passionate and full of promise. They were married in February of 1878, in the same church where Yates had proposed. Mrs. Henderson fussed over Grace like a mother, helping her into a dress that had belonged to Mrs. Henderson's own daughter. It was a simple cream-colored dress with lace at the collar and cuffs, and Grace had never felt more beautiful. The church was full of people from Red Bluff, all the friends Grace had made in her months there. Old Pete cried openly. The ranch hands from the boarding house stood in the back, grinning broadly. Even Mr. and Mrs. Patterson came with their baby. But Grace only had eyes for Yates, standing at the front of the church in his best suit, his face glowing with happiness as she walked down the aisle. When she reached him, he took her hand and whispered, "You are the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." They spoke their vows before God and their community, promising to love and cherish each other for the rest of their lives. And when the preacher said, "You may kiss your bride," Yates did so with such tenderness that more than a few people in the congregation sniffled. After the ceremony, there was a celebration at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. She had prepared a feast, and there was music and dancing. Grace danced with Yates, with old Pete, with the ranch hands, with everyone. Her face ached from smiling. As the celebration wound down and guests began to leave, Yates leaned down and whispered in Grace's ear, "Ready to go home, Mrs. Sullivan, Mrs. Sullivan." Grace loved the sound of that. "Yes," she said, "I am ready." Yates had prepared a surprise. He had been saving money for months, and with the help of his boss at the Double Bar Ranch, he had secured a small piece of land just outside of Red Bluff. On that land sat a cabin, modest but sturdy, that Yates had spent his spare time fixing up. It had a good roof, a stone fireplace, 2 rooms, and a porch that looked out over the valley. When he carried Grace over the threshold that night, she looked around at the clean, swept floors, the warm fire crackling in the hearth, the simple furniture, and she felt like she had finally found what she had been searching for all her life. Not just a home, but a place where she was loved and valued. "What do you think?" Yates asked anxiously. "It is not much now, but we can add on as we need to. I can build more rooms, maybe a bigger kitchen." "It is perfect," Grace said, wrapping her arms around his neck. "You are perfect." "No," Yates said, pulling her close. "But I promise you this, Grace. I will spend every day of my life trying to be the man you deserve. I will never take you for granted. I will never stop caring." Grace remembered that first night, freezing and alone, thinking that no one in the world cared if she lived or died. And then Yates had appeared, wrapping his blanket around her, saving her life and ultimately giving her a reason to live. "You already are the man I deserve," she said. "And I love you more than words can say." Their first night as husband and wife was everything Grace had hoped it would be. Yates was gentle and patient, showing her with actions what his words had already told her, that he loved her completely and would always put her first. The next morning they woke wrapped in each other's arms, the winter sun streaming through the window. Grace had never felt so content, so safe, so utterly happy. "Good morning, Mrs. Sullivan," Yates said, kissing her forehead. "Good morning, Mr. Sullivan," Grace replied, snuggling closer to his warmth. "What would you like to do today? We have the whole day to ourselves." "I just want to be with you," Grace said. "That is all I need." The months that followed were some of the happiest of Grace's life. She and Yates worked together to build their life on their small ranch. Yates continued working for the double bar, but he also began building their own herd of cattle, just a few head at first, but with plans to grow. Grace kept their home, cooked their meals, and helped with the ranch work when she could. They fell into an easy partnership, each supporting the other. When Yates had a hard day, Grace was there to listen and comfort him. When Grace struggled with loneliness on the isolated ranch, Yates made sure they went into town regularly so she could see her friends. Mrs. Henderson became like a mother to both of them, always ready with advice or help when they needed it. Old Pete taught Grace how to shoot a rifle, something Yates insisted on for her protection when he was away working. The community of Red Bluff embraced them as a couple, and Grace finally felt like she belonged somewhere. As spring turned to summer, Grace began to suspect she might be pregnant. She waited to be sure before telling Yates, visiting the doctor in Red Bluff who confirmed her suspicions. She was going to have a baby in the late fall. Grace planned how to tell Yates for days, wanting it to be special. Finally, one evening when he came home from working the range, exhausted and covered in dust, she had a special dinner waiting. She had roasted a chicken, made fresh bread, and even baked a pie, all of Yates's favorites. "What is the occasion?" Yates asked, washing up and looking at the spread on the table with delight. "Can a wife not make a special dinner for her husband without an occasion?" Grace asked innocently. "She can, but I know you, Grace Sullivan. You have something on your mind. What is it?" Grace took a deep breath. "I have some news. I saw the doctor today." Immediately, Yates's face filled with concern. "Are you sick? Is something wrong?" "No, nothing is wrong. Everything is right. Yates, we are going to have a baby." For a moment, Yates just stared at her as if he had not quite processed what she said. Then his face lit up with such pure joy that Grace felt tears spring to her eyes. "A baby," he said. "We are going to have a baby." "Yes. In November, the doctor thinks." Yates crossed the room in 2 strides and swept Grace up in his arms, spinning her around. "We are going to be parents." "Grace, this is the best news I have ever received." He set her down gently, suddenly cautious. "Should I have done that? Did I hurt you or the baby?" Grace laughed. "We are fine. I am not made of glass." But Yates was already fussing over her, making her sit down, bringing her water, asking 100 questions about what the doctor said and what she needed. Grace watched him with amusement and love, knowing that he was going to be a wonderful father. True to form, Yates spent the next several months preparing for the baby with the same dedication he brought to everything else. He built a cradle, sanding it smooth so there would be no splinters. He added a third room to their cabin to serve as a nursery. He made sure Grace had everything she needed, often bringing her little surprises from town, baby clothes or soft blankets. Grace's pregnancy was not easy. She was sick for the first few months, barely able to keep food down. Then, as she grew bigger, simple tasks became exhausting. But through it all, Yates was there, supporting her, encouraging her, taking over tasks when she could not manage them. "I feel like such a burden," Grace said one day in late October, frustrated with her own limitations. "You are not a burden," Yates said firmly. "You are growing our child, creating a new life. That is the most important work in the world. Everything else is just details." Their son was born on a cold night in early November of 1878, with Mrs. Henderson and the doctor attending. It was a long and difficult labor, and there were moments when Grace was not sure she could endure it. But every time she thought she could not go on, she looked at Yates, who had refused to leave her side, and she found the strength to continue. When the baby finally arrived, filling the cabin with his lusty cries, Grace felt a rush of love so powerful it took her breath away. The doctor placed the baby in her arms, and she looked down at his tiny red face, his dark hair, his perfect little fingers. "Hello, my darling," she whispered. "I am your mama." Yates was crying openly as he looked at his son. "He is perfect, Grace. He is absolutely perfect." They named him William after Yates's father, who had died when Yates was young. William Yates Sullivan, Little Will, as they immediately began calling him. Those first weeks with a newborn were exhausting. Will needed to be fed every few hours, day and night. He cried often, especially in the evenings. Grace was constantly tired, her body still recovering from the birth, but Yates was amazing. He took over all the household chores, cooked the meals, did the laundry. When Will cried in the night, Yates would get up with Grace, sitting with her while she nursed the baby, talking quietly to keep her awake. When Grace needed to rest, Yates would walk with Will, bouncing him gently, singing old cowboy songs in his rumbling voice. "You are going to spoil him," Grace said one afternoon, watching Yates rock Will to sleep. "Good," Yates said. "I want him to grow up knowing he is loved. I want him to always feel safe and cared for." Grace knew he was thinking of his own childhood, of the mother who had died young, of growing up without that security. She reached over and squeezed his hand. "He will," she promised. "With you as his father, he will always know he is loved." As Will grew from a newborn into an infant and then a toddler, Grace and Yates's little ranch prospered. The cattle herd grew. They added chickens and a milk cow. Yates built a proper barn and added more rooms to the cabin. It was hard work, but they were building something together, creating a legacy for their son. When Will was 2 years old, Grace became pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, and in the summer of 1881 they welcomed a daughter. They named her Sarah Grace Sullivan, and she looked like a perfect combination of both her parents, with Yates's dark hair and Grace's green eyes. Will was fascinated by his baby sister, always wanting to help with her, bringing her toys, singing to her in his sweet toddler voice. Watching him with Sarah, Grace's heart was so full she thought it might burst. "We are blessed," she said to Yates one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset. Will was playing in the yard, and Sarah was asleep in Grace's arms. "More blessed than I ever thought possible," Yates agreed. He put his arm around Grace, pulling her close. "Do you remember that first night when I found you freezing out on the range? How could I forget? You saved my life that night." "No," Yates said. "You saved mine. I did not even realize I needed saving until I met you. I was just existing, going through the motions. But you, Grace, you gave me a reason to live, not just exist. You gave me a family, a home, a purpose. You are everything to me." Grace turned to kiss him. "We saved each other then. We are partners, equals. That is what makes us strong." "Partners," Yates agreed. "Always." The years continued to pass, bringing both challenges and joys. There were droughts that threatened their cattle and winters that seemed endless. There were times when money was tight and they had to make hard choices. Grace lost a baby to miscarriage in 1883, a heartbreak that took time to heal from. But through everything, Grace and Yates faced life together. They supported each other, loved each other, and built a family and a ranch that became a source of pride for them both. They had 2 more children, another son in 1885 named James, and a daughter in 1888 named Elizabeth. Their cabin grew into a proper ranch house with multiple bedrooms, a large kitchen, and a parlor. The small herd of cattle grew into a substantial operation that rivaled some of the larger ranches in the area. Will grew into a strong, responsible young man who loved the ranch and wanted to stay and work it with his father. Sarah was gentle and kind, with a gift for music that delighted everyone. James was adventurous and fearless, always getting into mischief, but with such a good heart that no one could stay angry with him for long. Elizabeth was the baby, spoiled by everyone but especially by her father, who had a soft spot for his youngest daughter. Grace watched her children grow with pride and joy. She loved being a mother, loved the chaos and noise and constant activity of their household. But she never forgot where she had come from, never forgot that first terrible night when she had thought her life was over. Sometimes, when Yates was working late or away for a few days moving cattle, Grace would take out the wool blanket that he had wrapped around her that first night. She had kept it all these years, even though it was worn and faded now. She would hold it and remember and thank God for the man who had wrapped it around her, who had been the first to care, who had shown her what real love looked like. Mrs. Henderson remained a constant presence in their lives until she passed away peacefully in her sleep in 1890. Grace mourned her like a mother, grateful for the role the older woman had played in giving her a second chance at life. In her will, Mrs. Henderson left the boarding house to Grace, who decided to keep it running in her memory, hiring a manager but staying involved. Old Pete lived to the remarkable age of 90, finally passing in 1895. He had been a regular visitor to their ranch, and Grace's children had loved him like a grandfather. At his funeral, Grace told stories about how he had been one of the first people in Red Bluff to accept her, to defend her against Thomas Ridgeway's accusations. Speaking of Thomas Ridgeway, he never bothered Grace again after that confrontation in the general store. He continued drinking heavily, and his ranch fell into disrepair. Eventually, unable to maintain it, he sold the property and left Red Bluff. Grace heard years later that he had died in a bar fight in Sacramento. She felt pity for him more than anything else, for a man who had been so consumed by bitterness and cruelty that he could not see the possibility of something better. As Grace and Yates grew older, they faced the inevitable challenges of aging. Yates's back grew stiff from years of ranch work. Grace's hands developed arthritis that made sewing difficult. But they faced these changes together, adapting and supporting each other just as they always had. In 1900, as the new century dawned, Grace and Yates celebrated their 22nd wedding anniversary. Their children threw them a party at the ranch, inviting friends and neighbors from all over the area. There was food and music and dancing, just like at their wedding all those years ago. As the evening drew to a close and the guests began to leave, Grace and Yates found themselves alone on the porch, looking out over the land they had built together. The ranch was quiet now, peaceful in the twilight. 22 years, Yates said, shaking his head. Sometimes it feels like just yesterday that I found you freezing out on the range. Other times it feels like we have been together forever. Both, Grace said, leaning against him. It feels like both. Time is strange that way. Do you have any regrets? Yates asked. About leaving Boston, about everything you went through, Grace thought about it seriously. I regret the pain of losing my parents. I regret that I was so desperate that I almost married a monster. But I do not regret coming to Red Bluff. If I had not gotten on that stagecoach, if I had not met Thomas Ridgeway and then run from him, I would never have met you. And meeting you, loving you, building this life with you, it has been the greatest gift of my existence. Yates kissed the top of her head. I feel the same way. You know what I remember most about that first night? Not the cold or the fear of whether you would survive. I remember when you opened your eyes and looked at me, really looked at me, and you said I was the first to care. That broke my heart and healed it at the same time. I promised myself right then that I would never let you feel uncared for again. And you never have, Grace said. Every single day, you have shown me that I am loved and valued. You have been my partner, my best friend, the love of my life. Whatever challenges come in the years ahead, I know we will face them together, just like we always have. Always, Yates agreed, pulling her closer. Until my last breath, Grace Sullivan, I will love you until my last breath and beyond. They sat together as the stars came out, holding hands, comfortable in the silence that comes from years of companionship. Around them, their ranch settled into sleep. In the house behind them, their children were cleaning up from the party, their voices and laughter floating out into the night. Grace thought about the scared, desperate girl who had stepped off the stagecoach in Red Bluff in 1877. That girl had thought her life was over, that she had nothing left to lose. She could never have imagined this future, this beautiful life full of love and family and purpose. But then a cowboy had wrapped his blanket around her shivering body. He had been the first to care. And that simple act of kindness had changed everything, had set in motion a love story that would span decades, that would create a family and a legacy. Thank you, Grace said softly. For what? For being you. For seeing me that night when you could have just ridden past. For caring when no one else did. For loving me so completely. For giving me this beautiful life. Yates turned to her, and in the starlight his eyes were bright with emotion. Grace, you thanked me for caring that night, but you never understood. Saving you, loving you, building this life with you that did not just give you something. It gave me everything. You are my everything. You always have been and you always will be. They kissed then, a kiss that held all the passion and tenderness of their 22 years together. And as they sat on their porch under the California stars, Grace knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be, with exactly who she was meant to be with. The years continued to flow like the creek that ran through their property, steady and sure. Will took over more of the daily ranch operations as Yates grew older, though Yates never stopped working entirely. Sarah married a kind man from a neighboring ranch in 1902, and Grace threw herself into planning the wedding with joy. James decided to become a veterinarian, heading off to study in San Francisco, but always coming home for visits. Elizabeth showed a talent for teaching and began working at the school in Red Bluff. Grace and Yates became grandparents for the first time in 1903, when Sarah gave birth to a daughter. Holding that tiny baby girl, Grace felt the circle complete. She thought of her own mother, of the women who had come before her, and she felt connected to them in a new way. She was passing on the legacy of love and care that Yates had first shown her that cold October night so many years ago. More grandchildren followed, filling their lives with chaos and joy. The ranch house that had once seemed so spacious now felt perfectly sized for the regular family gatherings. Grace loved having all her children and grandchildren around, loved the noise and activity, loved watching Yates with his grandchildren, patient and kind and endlessly entertaining. In 1910, Grace and Yates celebrated their 32nd anniversary. They were in their 50s now, with gray in their hair and lines on their faces, but when they looked at each other, they still saw the young people who had fallen in love in Red Bluff all those years ago. "You remember how scared you were that first night?" Yates asked as they sat together in the parlor, watching the fire crackle. "Terrified," Grace admitted. "I thought I was going to die, and then you appeared and everything changed." "I have never regretted a single moment," Yates said, "not 1 second of our life together." "Neither have I," Grace said. "Even the hard times, we faced them together, and that made all the difference." As they sat together in comfortable silence, Grace reflected on the incredible journey her life had taken. From the desperate mail-order bride fleeing into the freezing night, to the matriarch of a thriving ranch and a large, loving family. It had not been easy, but it had been worth it. Every challenge, every hardship had been worth it for the life she had built with Yates. The ranch continued to prosper under Will's management, with Yates serving as an advisor and mentor to his son. Grace took great pride in seeing Will grow into a fine rancher, carrying on the legacy she and Yates had started. Sarah's family grew, giving Grace and Yates more grandchildren to love. James returned from his studies and opened a veterinary practice in Red Bluff, serving the ranching community with the same dedication his parents had shown. Elizabeth married a teacher from Sacramento, and they settled in Red Bluff to be near family. In 1915, as Yates approached his 60th birthday, he began to slow down more noticeably. His back, which had always given him trouble, was getting worse. He had trouble getting out of bed some mornings, and Grace would help him, rubbing liniment into his muscles, encouraging him gently. "We are getting old," Yates said one morning, only half joking. "We are getting older," Grace corrected. "But we are still here, still together. That is what matters." They spent more time on the porch those days, watching the ranch operate around them rather than being at the center of the action. But they did not mind. They had earned their rest, and they found contentment in simply being together. Grace's arthritis was worse too, making it difficult to do the fine needlework she had once loved. But she found other ways to stay busy, teaching her granddaughters to cook, telling stories of the old days, writing letters to friends and family scattered across California. On quiet evenings, when it was just the two of them, they would talk about their life together, remembering the good times and even some of the hard times, which seemed softer in memory. They would hold hands, content in the knowledge that they had lived well, loved well, and built something that would last beyond their own lives. In the spring of 1920, Yates became seriously ill. It started as a cough that would not go away, and the doctor diagnosed pneumonia. Despite the best care, despite all of Grace's desperate prayers, Yates grew weaker. He was confined to bed, and the family gathered, understanding that the end was near. Grace rarely left his side during those final days. She held his hand, spoke to him softly, reminded him of their life together. Their children came to say goodbye, bringing the grandchildren. Yates smiled at each of them, offered words of love and advice, but his eyes always returned to Grace, On a warm evening in May, as the sun was setting, Yates's breathing became more labored. Grace climbed into the bed beside him, cradling him gently. The family stood around the bed, but Grace was only aware of Yates. "I love you," she whispered. "I have loved you from that very first night. Thank you for caring when no one else did. Thank you for showing me what love really means. Thank you for giving me the most beautiful life I could have imagined." Yates's hand tightened weakly around hers. "Best decision I ever made," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Wrapping that blanket around you, getting to love you. Grace, you were my everything." "And you were mine," Grace said, tears streaming down her face. "You saved me in every way a person can be saved." "Partners," Yates whispered. "Partners," Grace agreed. "Always." Yates took one more rattling breath, his eyes fixed on Grace's face, a small smile on his lips, and then he was gone. Grace held him as her children gathered around her, supporting her, crying with her. She let them comfort her for a moment, but then she gently asked them to give her a few minutes alone with their father. When the room was empty, Grace looked down at the face she had loved for more than 40 years. Even in death, she could see the kindness there, the strength, the love that had defined who he was. "Thank you," she whispered one more time. "Thank you for being the first to care. Thank you for loving me so completely. I will miss you every day for the rest of my life, but I will never regret a single moment we had together. You made me believe in love, Yates Sullivan. You made me believe in myself. Rest now, my love. Rest knowing that you were the very best man I ever knew." She kissed his forehead one last time, then straightened his blankets and sat with him as the room grew dark, holding his hand and remembering. The funeral was huge, with people coming from all over the region to pay their respects. Yates had been beloved in the community, known for his fairness, his hard work, and his devotion to his family. Grace stood at his graveside, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, and listened as people shared stories about Yates. Each story was a testament to the man he had been, the lives he had touched. After Yates died, Grace moved into a smaller house in Red Bluff, closer to Elizabeth and James. The ranch was now fully Will's, and while she visited often, she found the memories too painful to live there without Yates. The smaller house was better for her anyway, easier to maintain with her arthritis. Her children worried about her, afraid she would sink into grief and never recover. But Grace was stronger than they realized. Yes, she missed Yates desperately. There was an ache in her chest that never fully went away. But she had promised him she would live well, and she intended to keep that promise. She threw herself into her grandchildren's lives, attending school events, helping with their homework, teaching the girls to cook and sew, telling the boys stories about their grandfather. She volunteered at the church, helping with the ladies' auxiliary and organizing charity events. She wrote long letters to her children and grandchildren, filling them with love and advice and stories from the past. On cold nights, she would take out that old wool blanket, the one Yates had wrapped around her shivering body on that long-ago October night in 1877. She would hold it and remember, and sometimes she would cry, but more often she would smile. Because that blanket represented everything good in her life. It was the moment when everything changed, when she discovered that love and kindness still existed in the world, when she met the man who would become her everything. Grace lived for another 15 years after Yates died, years filled with love and family and purpose. She saw her grandchildren grow up, marry, have children of their own. She became a great-grandmother multiple times over, the proud matriarch of a large and loving family. She told her story often, especially to the young women in her family. She wanted them to understand that life could be hard, that sometimes you had to be strong and brave in the face of terrible circumstances. But she also wanted them to know that love was real, that partnership was possible, that the right person would see you as an equal, would care about your happiness, would choose you every day. In the summer of 1935, at the age of 80, Grace became ill. It was not dramatic or sudden, just a slow fading, her body finally ready to rest. Her children gathered around her bed, along with many of her grandchildren and even some great-grandchildren. The room was full of love and family, exactly as it should be. As Grace lay there, floating in and out of consciousness, she thought about her long life. She thought about all the things she had seen and done, all the changes in the world around her. But mostly, she thought about love. She thought about Yates, about the life they had built together, about the family they had created. In her final moments, she could almost feel it, that old wool blanket wrapping around her shoulders. She could almost hear Yates's voice, gentle and concerned, asking if she was all right. She could almost feel the warmth of his body as he held her on that horse so long ago, promising her that everything would be all right. "You were right," she whispered, though no one in the room could make out the words. Everything was all right, better than all right. It was beautiful. Grace Sullivan died peacefully in her sleep that night, surrounded by the family that had been her greatest joy. At her funeral, they buried her next to Yates, and on her tombstone, her children had inscribed words that seemed to capture her spirit. She lived, she loved, she was loved. But the story did not truly end there, because Grace and Yates's legacy lived on in their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren. The ranch they had built together continued to thrive, passed down through generations. The love they had shared became a model for their descendants, a reminder that true partnership was possible, that kindness mattered, that caring for each other was the most important thing. And sometimes, on cold October nights in Red Bluff, when the wind blew down from the Sierra Nevada mountains, people would tell the story of the mail-order bride who had fled into the freezing darkness, and the cowboy who had wrapped his blanket around her. They would tell how she had said he was the first to care, and how that simple act of kindness had blossomed into a love story that spanned decades, that created a family that changed lives. It became a legend in Red Bluff, passed down through generations. A reminder that sometimes in our darkest moments, salvation comes in unexpected forms. That kindness matters. That caring for each other, truly caring, can change everything. That love, real love, is worth fighting for, worth building on, worth dedicating a lifetime to nurturing and protecting. The old wool blanket, carefully preserved by Grace throughout her life, was passed down to Sarah, then to Sarah's daughter, then to her granddaughter. Each generation heard the story of that cold October night in 1877, of the desperate young woman and the kind cowboy, of how a simple act of wrapping a blanket around someone could lead to such a beautiful, full life. And the story lived on, a testament to the power of compassion, the strength of partnership, and the enduring nature of true love. Because in the end, that is what mattered most. Not the hardships or the challenges, not the fear or the cold or the danger. What mattered was that on that night, when Grace needed it most, someone cared. Someone saw her suffering and chose to help. Someone wrapped his blanket around her, and in doing so, wrapped his heart around hers as well. And from that single moment of kindness, of caring, of choosing to see another person's humanity and respond to it, came a lifetime of love, a family, a legacy. A story worth telling and retelling, reminding each generation that caring for each other, that simple, fundamental act of human kindness, is where all the best stories begin.